The biting Wyoming wind whipped across the vast, desolate expanse of the Blackwater Auction Yard, carrying with it the scent of dust, fear, and desperation. It was a place where fortunes were made and lost, where the value of a life was determined by the sharp, rhythmic cadence of an auctioneer's call. In the far corner of the yard, tucked away from the prime livestock pens, was a small, dilapidated enclosure that most buyers didn't even bother to glance at. This was the last chance pen, a place for the broken, the sick, and the worthless. Inside this pen, a lone figure stood against the relentless wind, a creature that embodied the very spirit of rejection. It was a young bison bull, barely a year old, but already bearing the weight of a lifetime of hardship. His once thick coat was matted and thin in patches, revealing a latticework of scars and a frame that was far too gaunt for his breed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He stood with his massive head hung low, one of his horns broken at the base, a jagged, ugly wound that spoke of a violent past. The auction house had labeled him Lot 731, but the ranch hands had a crueler name for him, the Ghost, because he seemed to already have one foot in the next world. For 3 days, Lot 731 had refused all food and water, his dark, intelligent eyes holding a profound emptiness that seemed to absorb the bleakness of his surroundings. He was the survivor of a brutal winter and a recent wolf attack that had decimated his small, independent herd. Captured by ranchers, he was deemed too aggressive and too injured to be of any value. The auction was his final stop, a formality before an inevitable, inglorious end. "All right, folks, let's wrap this up," bellowed the auctioneer, his voice booming over the loudspeaker, eager to get to the more profitable lots. "We've got Lot 731, a young bull, as is. What am I bid for this one? Do I hear $50? 20, 10? Silence was his only answer. The handful of buyers who were still lingering glanced at the bison with a mixture of pity and disdain. They saw a liability, a vet bill waiting to happen, a creature whose spirit was as broken as his horn. Standing at the back of the small crowd, leaning heavily on a gnarled wooden cane, was an old man the locals knew only as Silas. Silas was as much a fixture of this desolate landscape as the sagebrush and the wind. He was a man in his late 70s, with a face like a roadmap of a hard-lived life, his hands gnarled by arthritis, but his eyes holding a clarity that saw things others missed. He had been a trapper, a ranch hand, a wanderer, and now, in his old age, he lived a solitary life in a small, run-down cabin on the outskirts of town, a place almost as rejected as the bison in the pen. Silas had not come to the auction to buy. He came to watch, to feel the pulse of the world he had known his whole life. But as he watched the young bison, he saw something beyond the scars and the broken horn. He saw a flicker of defiance in the depths of those dark eyes, a stubborn refusal to completely surrender to the despair that surrounded him. It was a look Silas recognized, for he had seen it in his own reflection many times. "Come on now, someone give me $1, the auctioneer pleaded, his voice laced with impatience. "Just $1 to get him off our books. Otherwise, he's bound for the rendering plant." A murmur went through the small crowd. It was a sad but necessary part of the business. Not every animal could be a winner. As the auctioneer raised his gavel, ready to declare the bison worthless and seal his fate, a quiet voice, weathered and rough like old leather, cut through the cold air. $1, Silas said, his voice barely a whisper, but carrying the weight of a lifetime of conviction. The auctioneer paused, looking out into the crowd to find the source of the bid. He saw Silas, a man he had seen at these auctions for years, a man who never bought anything. "Sir, you understand this animal is being sold as is? No guarantees, no returns," the auctioneer said, a hint of patronizing concern in his voice. Silas simply nodded, his gaze fixed on the bison. He fumbled in his worn-out coat pocket and produced a single, crumpled dollar bill. It was a gesture so simple, yet so profound, that it silenced the entire yard. The transaction was swift. The dollar was exchanged, a bill of sale was signed with a shaky hand, and Silas, the old man who lived on the scraps of the world, became the owner of a broken bison that nobody else wanted. The ranch hands who helped him load the bison onto his ancient, rust-eaten truck couldn't hide their amusement. "What are you going to do with him, old man?" one of them asked, a smirk on his face. "He'll be dead by morning." Silas didn't answer. He simply looked at the bison, who had been coaxed into the truck bed with a weary reluctance, and saw not a dying animal, but a kindred spirit. As the old truck rumbled away from the auction yard, a journey began that would challenge the very limits of hope and healing. It was a journey that would take a single dollar, a rejected old man, and a broken bison, and weave them into a legend that would echo through the canyons of Wyoming for generations to come. What could an old man with nothing possibly offer a creature that had been so completely broken by the world? And could a bond forged in the crucible of rock bottom truly have the power to perform a miracle? The journey from the Blackwater Auction Yard to Silas's remote cabin was a slow, arduous one. The old truck, a relic from a bygone era, groaned under the weight of its new passenger, its engine sputtering in protest against the steep, unpaved roads. Inside the truck bed, the young bison stood unsteadily, his massive form swaying with every bump and turn. Silas drove with a careful deliberation he hadn't employed in years, his gnarled hands gripping the steering wheel as he glanced periodically in the rearview mirror. He could see the bison's reflection, a dark, forlorn shape against the backdrop of the setting sun. The animal's eyes were closed, not in peace, but in a state of weary resignation that tugged at something deep within Silas's soul. Silas's cabin was not much more than a shack, a testament to a life lived without excess. It was a single room, built of reclaimed timber and insulated with a mixture of mud and straw, with a stone fireplace that was the heart of the home. Beside it was a small, sturdy corral Silas had built years ago for a horse that had long since passed away. It was here, in this humble sanctuary, that the bison's new life, or his final days, would begin. Unloading the animal was a challenge. The bison, weak and disoriented, refused to move. He had been prodded, pushed, and forced for so long that he had learned that stillness was his only defense. Silas didn't try to force him. Instead, he simply opened the gate of the truck bed, lowered the ramp, and then sat down on a nearby tree stump, a silent, patient vigil under the vast, star-dusted sky. "I ain't gonna hurt you, son," Silas said softly, his voice carried away by the wind. "This here's your place now. You can come out when you're ready." For hours, Silas sat there, the cold of the Wyoming night seeping into his old bones. He talked to the bison, not in a commanding or coaxing tone, but in the rambling, conversational way of a man who had spent more time with nature than with people. He told the bison about his life, about the mountains he had climbed, the rivers he had crossed, the storms he had weathered. He spoke of loneliness, of loss, of the stubborn, inexplicable will to keep going when everything tells you to stop. As the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of rose and gold, the bison finally moved. Slowly, cautiously, he took a step down the ramp, his injured leg trembling under his weight. He stood in the corral, his breath creating plumes of steam in the cold morning air, and looked at Silas. For the first time, there was something other than emptiness in his eyes. It was a flicker of curiosity, a question mark in the vast wilderness of his despair. If this story of an old man's compassion is touching your heart, we would be so grateful if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue sharing these incredible tales of hope and unlikely friendships. It proves that even the smallest act of kindness can create the biggest ripples of change. The first few weeks were a delicate dance of trust and fear. Silas named the bison Echo, for the way the animal seemed to be a reflection of the silent, resilient spirit of the canyons themselves. Echo's physical wounds were severe. The broken horn was a constant source of pain, and the infection in his leg had grown worse. Silas, using knowledge passed down from his Native American grandmother, began treating the wounds with a poultice of crushed sage and juniper berries, a fragrant, earthy remedy that seemed to soothe the animal more than any modern medicine could. He would spend hours just sitting in the corral with Echo, never getting too close, simply allowing the bison to grow accustomed to his presence. He would bring him fresh water from the mountain spring and buckets of sweet oats, which Echo initially ignored. For days, the bison refused to eat, his body still locked in a state of shutdown. Silas never pushed. He would simply leave the food and water and return later to clear it away, his heart aching with each uneaten meal. The breakthrough came on the 5th day. Silas was sitting in his usual spot, humming an old forgotten folk song, when Echo took a tentative step toward the water bucket. He dipped his nose in, drank deeply, and then, to Silas's astonishment, he turned to the bucket of oats and began to eat. It was a small victory, but to Silas, it felt like the turning of a great tide. As Echo slowly began to regain his physical strength, Silas started to address the deeper wounds, the ones that couldn't be seen. He knew that Echo's aggression and fear were born of trauma. The bison had known nothing but violence and rejection from humans. Silas's approach was to simply be present, to be a source of calm, predictable kindness in a world that had been anything but. He never raised his voice, never made sudden movements. He would simply sit, talk, and occasionally extend a hand, not to touch, but as an offering of peace. Echo, in turn, began to change. The wild, panicked look in his eyes was slowly replaced by a watchful intelligence. He started to follow Silas's movements with his gaze, his ears twitching at the sound of the old man's voice. He would allow Silas to get closer, to tend to his wounds without flinching. A silent language was developing between them, a language of mutual respect and shared solitude. The local community, what little of it there was, remained skeptical. The mailman, a jovial man named Hank, would shake his head every time he delivered Silas's mail. "Still got that ghost with you, Silas?" he'd ask. "I'm surprised he's lasted this long." Dr. Aris Thorne, the region's overworked veterinarian, had heard about Silas's $1 purchase and had driven out to the cabin one afternoon, expecting to find a dying animal and a foolish old man. What he found instead left him speechless. Echo was standing in the corral, his coat beginning to regain its luster, and Silas was sitting just a few feet away, mending a piece of leather. The bison was calm, almost serene, a stark contrast to the terrified, aggressive creature Dr. Thorne had seen at the auction. "I don't understand it," Dr. Thorne admitted after examining Echo at Silas's invitation. "Medically speaking, with that infection and his initial condition, he shouldn't have survived. What you're doing here, it's not in any of my textbooks." Silas just smiled, a network of wrinkles spreading across his face. "Ain't no medicine for a broken spirit, Doc," he said. "Sometimes all a creature needs is a reason to live." As winter began to loosen its icy grip on the Wyoming landscape, a new chapter was beginning for the old man and the rejected bison. Echo's physical wounds were healing, but more importantly, the invisible scars on his soul were beginning to fade. He was learning to trust, to accept kindness, to believe that not all humans were a source of pain. But the wilderness of Wyoming is a place of unforeseen challenges, and a new test was on the horizon, a test that would reveal the true depth of the bond between man and beast, and uncover a hidden ability in Echo that would shock everyone who had written him off as worthless. What secret did the rejected bison hold, and how would it change the lives of everyone in this remote, forgotten corner of the world? The bond between Silas and Echo deepened with the passing seasons, settling into a rhythm as steady and comforting as the turning of the earth. Echo had transformed from a gaunt, broken creature into a magnificent specimen of his breed. His coat grew thick and dark, his muscles rippled with newfound strength, and his one good horn gleamed in the sunlight. The broken one remained a jagged testament to his past, a scar that he would always carry, but it no longer defined him. He had become Silas's shadow, following the old man around the property with a quiet devotion that was both humbling and awe-inspiring. He would wait by the cabin door in the morning and rest his massive head on the corral fence in the evening, his dark eyes fixed on Silas with an expression of unwavering loyalty. Silas, in turn, had found a new purpose in his twilight years. Caring for Echo had given him a reason to rise each morning, a companion to share the silence with. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for so long had been replaced by a sense of profound connection. He had poured his own resilient spirit into the bison, and in doing so, had healed parts of himself he hadn't even realized were broken. The world, for the most part, left them alone. But the whispers of the miracle bison had begun to travel. On the wind, reaching the ears of ranchers and townsfolk who had long since dismissed Silas as a crazy old hermit. Some came to see for themselves, driving up the winding road to Silas's cabin, their skepticism slowly melting away as they witnessed the gentle giant and the old man who had saved him. But it was a dramatic, life-threatening event that would truly reveal the extraordinary nature of their bond and uncover an ability in Echo that no one could have predicted. It happened on a sweltering afternoon in late August. The sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue, began to darken with an unnatural speed. A strange metallic smell filled the air, and a low, ominous rumble echoed through the canyons. Silas, who had read the signs of the sky his entire life, knew that this was no ordinary summer storm. He had seen a sky like this only once before. Decades ago, when a dry lightning strike had ignited a wildfire that had consumed thousands of acres of forest. He moved quickly, his old joints protesting as he worked to secure his small cabin, reinforcing the shutters and clearing the dry brush from around the perimeter. Echo was unusually agitated, pacing back and forth in his corral, his nostrils flared as he sniffed the charged air. He let out a series of low, guttural grunts, a sound Silas had never heard him make before. It was a sound of urgent warning. "Easy, son," Silas said, his voice calm despite the growing knot of fear in his stomach. "It's just a storm. We'll ride it out." But Echo's agitation only grew. He began to push against the corral gate with his massive head, his powerful body, straining against the thick wooden beams. He was trying to tell Silas something that the old man couldn't yet understand. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning, sharp and jagged, split the sky, striking a tall pine tree on the ridge overlooking Silas's property. The tree exploded in a shower of sparks, and within seconds, a plume of thick, black smoke was billowing into the sky. The wildfire had begun, and the wind, which was now howling like a banshee, was pushing it directly towards Silas's cabin. Panic, cold and sharp, gripped Silas. His cabin, his home, everything he owned, was in the path of the inferno. He knew. He had to evacuate, but his old truck, his only means of escape, had broken down a week ago, its engine finally giving up the ghost. He was trapped. He looked at Echo, who was now ramming the gate. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. With a desperate ferocity. And in that moment, Silas understood. Echo wasn't just warning him, he was trying to save him. "All right, Echo," Silas shouted over the roar of the wind and the approaching fire. "All right, I'm coming." He unlatched the gate, and the bison burst out, not running away from the fire, but towards the back of the property, towards the steep, rocky cliffs that formed a natural barrier. He would stop every few feet, looking back to make sure Silas was following, his urgent grunts cutting through the chaos. The heat from the fire was becoming intense, the air thick with smoke that burned Silas's lungs. His old body was screaming in protest, but he pushed on, his trust in the Bison absolute. Echo led him to a place Silas had forgotten existed, a narrow crevice in the cliff face, almost completely hidden by a thick growth of hardy mountain shrubs. It was the entrance to a small, shallow cave, a place that would offer shelter from the flames. Echo pushed Silas towards the entrance with his head, a gentle but firm insistence. The old man stumbled inside, collapsing onto the cool, damp earth of the cave floor, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Echo didn't follow him in. Instead, the massive Bison positioned himself at the entrance of the cave, his body acting as a shield, a living wall between the man who had saved him and the raging inferno that was now consuming the land. He stood there, resolute and unwavering, as the fire washed over the ridge, his thick coat singed, his eyes stinging from the smoke, but his spirit unbroken. He had been rejected, sold for $1, left for dead. But in this moment of ultimate crisis, he had become a savior, a guardian, a testament to the incredible power of loyalty and love that exists in the heart of all living things. The fire raged for 2 days. From the safety of the cave, Silas watched as the world he knew was transformed into a scorched, blackened landscape. He shared his small canteen of water with Echo, who would periodically turn his massive head into the cave to check on the old man, his eyes conveying a message of reassurance and shared survival. When the fire finally passed and a rescue team, organized by Dr. Thorne and Hank the mailman, made their way up the mountain, they were prepared to find the worst. They found Silas's cabin reduced to a pile of smoldering ash, the land around it a monochrome of black and gray. But as they approached the cliff face, they saw a sight that would be seared into their memories forever. The giant Bison Echo was standing sentinel at the mouth of a cave, his body covered in soot, but otherwise unharmed. And from behind him, Silas emerged, weak and exhausted, but alive. The story of what had happened spread like the wildfire itself. The tale of the $1 Bison who had become a hero, who had saved the life of the old man who had shown him kindness, became a local legend. News crews arrived, reporters clamored for interviews, and the quiet, forgotten corner of Wyoming was suddenly in the national spotlight. Silas, a man who had lived his life in the shadows, found himself at the center of a story that captured the heart of the nation. But for him, the story wasn't about heroism or fame. It was about the unbreakable bond he had forged with a creature that the world had thrown away. What happens when the world discovers a miracle in its own backyard? And how would the newfound fame change the lives of the old man and the Bison who had asked for nothing but to be left in peace? The aftermath of the fire brought a wave of change that Silas could never have anticipated. His quiet, solitary life was over, replaced by a constant stream of visitors, reporters, and well-wishers who traveled from all corners of the country to see the hero Bison and the old man he had saved. The story of Echo's loyalty and Silas's compassion had struck a chord with a public hungry for tales of hope and goodness. Donations poured in, a fund was set up by the local community, and within weeks, there was enough money to rebuild Silas's cabin, and then some. A team of volunteer builders, led by a contractor from Cheyenne who had been moved by the story, descended on the property. They built Silas a new home, a beautiful sturdy cabin with large windows that looked out over the healing landscape. They also built a new, larger barn for Echo, a place of comfort and security that was a world away from the last chance pen where his journey with Silas had begun. But with the new cabin and the fame came a new set of challenges. Silas, a man who cherished his solitude, found himself overwhelmed by the attention. He was gracious to everyone who came, but the constant intrusion wore on him. More importantly, he worried about Echo, the Bison, who had found peace in the quiet rhythm of their life together, was becoming stressed by the constant presence of strangers. He would often retreat to the far corner of his new pasture, his old anxieties resurfacing. Dr. Aris Thorne, who had become a close friend to Silas, saw the toll the fame was taking. "You know, Silas," he said one evening as they watched Echo from the porch of the new cabin, "this story doesn't belong to the world. It belongs to you and him. You have every right to reclaim your peace." It was then that an idea began to form, an idea that would allow them to share their story without sacrificing their sanctuary. With the help of Dr. Thorne and the considerable funds that had been donated, Silas established the Echo's Haven Bison Sanctuary. The sanctuary was not a tourist attraction, but a protected refuge for bison who, like Echo, had been injured, orphaned, or rejected. The mission was simple: to provide a place of healing and lifelong care for these magnificent creatures who were so often misunderstood. Silas's property was expanded, fences were built, and soon Echo had company. The first to arrive was a young female calf who had been orphaned during a harsh winter. Echo, who had never been part of a herd as an adult, surprised everyone by immediately taking the calf under his protection. He became her surrogate father, her guardian, her gentle teacher. His own traumatic past had not made him bitter. It had made him empathetic. He seemed to understand the pain and fear of the newcomers, and his calm, steady presence helped them to heal. The sanctuary became Silas's life's work, his legacy. He worked with a small, dedicated team, including Hank the mailman who had taken an early retirement to help his old friend. They didn't offer public tours, but they did establish an educational program, partnering with local schools and universities. Students would come to the sanctuary not just to learn about bison, but to learn about the power of compassion, the importance of second chances, and the profound, healing connection that can exist between humans and animals. Silas found a new kind of contentment. He could share his story and his wisdom without being at the center of a media circus. He spent his days caring for his herd, watching them roam free over the rolling hills of his property, a landscape that was slowly but surely recovering from the fire. New green shoots pushing their way through the blackened earth, a symbol of nature's own resilience. Echo remained the heart of the sanctuary, its patriarch, its living legend. He never lost his special bond with Silas. Every evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the old man would walk out to the pasture, and the giant bison would amble over to meet him. They would stand together, man and beast, two old souls who had found each other in the scrap heap of the world and had built something beautiful and lasting. One evening, as they stood in their usual spot, a young veterinary student who was volunteering at the sanctuary watched them in awe. "It's amazing, Mr. Silas," she said, "how you saw something in him that no one else could see." Silas looked at Echo, who rested his massive head against the old man's shoulder in a familiar gesture of affection. "I didn't see something in him," Silas replied, his voice soft but clear. "I saw something of myself in him. We were both thrown away. We both had our share of broken parts. Turns out, sometimes the most broken things can be put back together to make something stronger than they ever were before." The story of the $1 bison had come full circle. It was no longer a tale of a single, miraculous event, but a continuous living story of healing and hope. The sanctuary became a testament to the idea that nothing and no one is ever truly worthless. It showed that with a little bit of kindness, a lot of patience, and the courage to see value where others see none, the most rejected among us can become the source of the greatest inspiration. Have you ever witnessed a situation where something or someone that was written off as hopeless turned out to be incredibly valuable? Share your own stories of second chances and unexpected transformations in the comments below. Echo lived to be a grand old age, the revered leader of a thriving herd, a symbol of the enduring power of the wild spirit. And Silas, the old man, who had spent a single dollar on a broken animal, passed away peacefully in his sleep one night, his heart full, his legacy secure in the sanctuary that bore his friend's name. The story of their bond continues to be told in Wyoming, a modern-day fable that reminds us all that the greatest treasures are often found in the most unlikely of places, and that the best investment a person can ever make is in an act of kindness. Legend of Silas and Echo became woven into the very fabric of the Wyoming landscape, a story told around campfires and in classrooms, a modern myth that spoke of an ancient truth. Echo's Haven Bison Sanctuary thrived, a testament to a bond that had turned a single dollar into a sprawling legacy of healing. But legacies, like the sturdy cabins built to withstand the mountain winters, must be tended. They require new hands, new hearts to carry the torch forward when the original flame flickers and fades. A decade after Silas was laid to rest on the ridge overlooking the sanctuary, beside a simple stone marker for his friend Echo, the Haven faced a challenge of a kind it had never known. The problem arrived in a fleet of livestock trucks, a procession that felt more like a funeral cortege than a rescue. Inside were 30 bison, the entire population of a failed ecotourism park in Utah. The park's owner, a man with more money than sense, had gone bankrupt, abandoning the animals to starvation and neglect. On paper, it was the sanctuary's greatest triumph, the largest single rescue in its history. In reality, it was a looming disaster. This was not a herd. It was a collection of traumatized strangers, forced to live together in an unnatural environment. Their social bonds shattered, their instincts warped by years of being treated as living props. They were a ghost herd, physically present, but spiritually absent. They moved like a fractured entity, never grazing together, never forming the protective circles that defined a healthy herd. They were 30 individuals suffering in a crowd, and their collective despair cast a palpable shadow over the Haven. At their center was a formidable matriarch the Utah Park had named Caldera. She was a magnificent, terrifying creature with a wildness in her eyes that bordered on madness. She tolerated no approach, human or bison. She enforced a brutal, solitary authority, scattering any of the others that came too close, her fury. As unpredictable and explosive as the volcanic crater for which she was named. The seasoned staff at Echo's Haven, led by the now silver-haired and deeply wise Hank, were at a loss. The methods of Silas, the patient, quiet presence that had healed Echo and dozens of others, failed with this group. The trauma was too widespread, the social fabric too shredded. Caldera's aggressive distrust infected the others, creating a feedback loop of fear and isolation. For the first time since its founding, the sanctuary felt a chill of failure in the air. It was into this quiet crisis that Leo arrived. Leo was 17, sharp-witted, and carried with him the restless, humming energy of a city. He was the great-nephew of Dr. Arish Thorne, who now in his late 80s served as the chairman of the sanctuary's board. Leo had gotten into trouble. Back in California, not serious trouble, but the kind born of boredom and a brilliant mind left to its own devices. Hacking, digital trespassing, a general disregard for rules he deemed illogical. His parents, at their wits' end, had agreed to Dr. Thorne's unconventional proposal, a summer of community service at the sanctuary. Leo arrived in Wyoming with a laptop full of code, a smartphone that was his lifeline, and a profound simmering resentment for being exiled to what he considered the middle of nowhere. He saw the sanctuary not as a place of healing, but as a punishment, a primitive backwater devoid of eye and intellectual stimulation. He listened to Hank's stories of Silas and Echo with a polite, vacant smile, mentally cataloging them as quaint, statistically insignificant fables. "The problem here is a lack of data," Leo announced during his first week, after observing the ghost herd from a distance through the lens of his phone's camera. "You're all operating on anecdote and feeling. We need metrics. We need to understand." their behavior patterns, their social networks, or lack thereof. Hank, whose hands were calloused from decades of mending fences and tending to sick animals, looked at the boy with a patience that was stretched thin. "Son, we operate on respect and trust. You can't quantify a broken heart." Silas knew that. He didn't use metrics on Echo. He used kindness. Leo scoffed internally. Kindness wasn't a scalable solution. He pitched his idea to his great-uncle Aris, a non-invasive surveillance system. He wanted to deploy a small fleet of silent drones to map the herd's movements, use facial recognition algorithms to track individual interactions, and build a predictive model of Caldera's behavior. "We can find the source of the behavioral contagion," Leo argued, his voice alive with the passion he usually reserved for a complex piece of code. "We can identify the key nodes in the network and intervene with precision." Dr. Thorne, seeing the same clinical detachment in Leo that he himself had possessed all those years ago, before Silas and Echo had humbled him, reluctantly agreed to a limited trial. He knew that telling the boy he was wrong would be useless. Leo had to discover it for himself. The day Leo launched his primary drone was a clear, windless afternoon. The machine, a sleek, state-of-the-art quadcopter, lifted into the air with a nearly imperceptible hum. On his laptop screen, Leo saw the world as he preferred it, a clean, top-down view, data points to be collected and analyzed. He maneuvered the drone high above the ghost herd, its camera zooming in on Caldera, who was standing apart from the others, her massive head outlined against the sagebrush. As Leo brought the drone lower for a clearer image, a subtle shift occurred. A high frequency, inaudible to human ears, but a piercing shriek to the sensitive hearing of a bison, filled the air. Caldera's head shot up. Her eyes, which had been dull with apathy, now blazed with primal terror. She saw not a piece of technology, but a predator, an unnatural bird of prey descending from the sky. She let out a bellow of pure panic and charged. But she didn't charge the sky. She charged the only thing she could, the nearest bison, a young male who was himself starting to panic from the sound. The collision was brutal. The young male was thrown to the ground, his leg twisting at an unnatural angle. The rest of the herd exploded into a chaotic stampede, running blindly, their collective terror amplified by Caldera's renewed rage. Hank and the staff rushed into the pasture, their faces grim, working to calm the animals and tend to the injured male. Leo could only watch on his screen, the clean data replaced by a messy, chaotic reality he had caused. He landed the drone, its quiet hum now sounding like a scream of failure. He had approached the problem with logic and precision, and all he had managed to do was inflict more pain, more trauma. That evening, a heavy silence filled the main cabin. Hank didn't say "I told you so." He didn't have to. The quiet disappointment in the old man's eyes was far worse. Later, Dr. Thorne found Leo sitting on the porch, his laptop closed, his face illuminated by the cold glow of his phone. "The drone trial is over," Leo said, his voice flat. "It's not your fault, son," Aris said gently. "Your logic was sound. But this place, these animals, they operate on a different kind of logic." He placed a heavy, leather-bound book on the table beside Leo. It was old, its cover worn smooth with time. "This was Silas's journal. I think he would have wanted you to read it." Leo looked at the journal with disdain. He didn't want fables. He wanted solutions. But for the first time in his life, he was out of them. He had failed publicly and spectacularly. Defeated, he opened the book. The pages were filled with a spidery, determined script. It wasn't a daily log of activities. It was a conversation, a man's dialogue with his own soul and with the soul of a broken animal. Leo read about Silas's loneliness, his quiet observations of the natural world. He read about the day at the auction, the feeling of seeing a kindred spirit in the eyes of a rejected animal. He read about the painstaking patience of those first few weeks, the poultices made of sage, the quiet one-sided conversations, the simple repeated offerings of food that were, in truth, offerings of trust. He read about the fire, about the terror in the smoke, and about the moment a bison that had every reason to flee had instead turned to become a shield. Leo stayed up all night, the glow of his phone replaced by the warm, dim light of a single lamp. He wasn't reading about a myth. He was reading a manual, a detailed instruction set for a type of engineering he had never considered, the rebuilding of a spirit. He learned that Silas's power wasn't in what he did, but in what he didn't do. He didn't force, he didn't command, he didn't even expect. He simply offered an alternative to the world of fear Echo had always known. He offered a choice. The next morning, Leo did something that shocked Hank more than the drone had. He left all his technology in the cabin. He walked out to the edge of the pasture where the ghost herd grazed in their fractured patterns, and he sat down on the ground, leaning his back against a weathered fence post. He did nothing. He didn't look at them, didn't speak. He just sat. He was offering them the one thing he had never valued, his quiet, unobtrusive presence. He did this for a week. The sun beat down on him. The wind chilled him. He was bored out of his mind. The herd ignored him completely, their indifference. A heavy blanket. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. His mind, used to constant stimulation, screamed for a distraction. But he remembered Silas's journal, the years of solitude that had prepared the old man for the patience required to save one life. Leo was only trying to last a few weeks. He could do this. The change, when it came, was almost imperceptible. It was the end of the second week. Leo was half dozing in the afternoon sun when he sensed a presence. He opened his eyes. Caldera was standing 50 feet away, watching him. She wasn't aggressive, not panicked. She was simply curious. The analytical part of Leo's brain, which he couldn't completely shut off, noted that this was the first time she had held a calm gaze on a human for more than a few seconds. He didn't move, didn't even breathe too deeply. He met her gaze, held it, and then slowly looked away, a gesture of non-aggression he'd read about in one of Silas's entries. He was not a threat. He was just part of the landscape. Caldera watched him for another 10 minutes, then turned and walked away. It was not a breakthrough. It was the cracking of a door. Remembering the story of the oats, Leo adapted the method to his own world. The next day, he brought something from his own small stash of snacks he'd brought from the city, a perfect red apple. He walked to the fence post where he always sat, placed the apple on top of it, and walked away without looking back. It was an offering freely given, with no expectation of return. The next morning, the apple was gone. He didn't know who took it. It could have been a deer, a bird, another bison. It didn't matter. The offering had been accepted by the world. He continued the ritual every single day. He would sit for hours, then leave the apple. The herd's behavior began to shift in subtle ways. The space between them seemed to shrink. They would graze a little closer to each other, their movements less frantic. They were still not a herd, but they were no longer a collection of terrified atoms. They were becoming a community of survivors, and Leo, the silent boy with the apples, was somehow becoming the anchor point around which they oriented themselves. The true test came during a sudden, violent thunderstorm that rolled in from the mountains. A flash flood sent a torrent of water rushing through a dry creek bed that cut through the pasture. A young calf, one of the smallest of the ghost herd, lost its footing and was swept into the churning, muddy water, its leg becoming trapped between two large rocks. The calf's cries of panic sent the herd into a frenzy. They ran back and forth along the bank, their distress palpable, but their broken social instincts left them helpless. Caldera was the most frantic of all, charging at the water's edge, bellowing in a rage of impotence. Hank and the staff arrived, but couldn't get close. Caldera's panicked aggression kept them at bay, viewing them as predators threatening the trapped calf. But then Leo walked slowly, deliberately, into the heart of the chaos. He didn't look at the calf. He walked toward Caldera. He moved with the same quiet calm he had practiced for weeks, his hands open at his sides. He stopped about 20 feet from the raging matriarch and simply stood, making eye contact. He said nothing. He just stood there, a beacon of stillness in the storm. Caldera's bellows subsided into heaving breaths. She looked at the boy, and in her wild eyes, something shifted. She saw not a threat, but the boy with the apples, the boy who sat with them, the boy who offered peace without asking for anything. In return, she took a step back, then another, giving him space. She was granting him permission. It was all the opening Hank and his team needed. They were able to get to the calf, working quickly to free its trapped leg. They brought the shivering, terrified animal back to the bank and into the anxious group. Caldera immediately went to the calf, nudging it, licking it, her maternal instincts finally overriding her trauma. The herd, for the first time, gathered around them, forming a protective circle, a perfect, instinctive ring of bodies against the storm. They had become a herd. From the edge of the circle, Caldera looked over at Leo, who was soaked to the bone, shivering in the rain. It was not a look of gratitude, not in a human sense. It was a look of acknowledgement, a look of respect, a look that said you belong. That evening, as Leo sat wrapped in a blanket in the warm cabin, sipping hot cocoa that Hank had made for him, he looked at his laptop, sitting dormant in the corner. He had come to Wyoming to solve a problem with data and algorithms. He had failed. Instead, he had solved it with a lesson from a dead man's journal, with patience, with respect, and with a bag of apples. He realized Silas's wisdom wasn't about rejecting the new, but about understanding the timeless. It was a different kind of code, an older one, written not in ones and zeros, but in the silent language of the heart. He had not just saved a herd. He had saved himself from the sterile logic of his own mind. He was no longer just a Reese Thorne's great-nephew. He was the next chapter in the story of Echo's Haven, a bridge between the wisdom of the past and the challenges of the future. A boy who had learned that the most profound connections are not found on a network, but in the quiet, shared spaces where one spirit simply chooses to be present with another. The ghost herd was home. And so was he. The autumn that followed the great storm was a season of quiet miracles at Echo's Haven. The Caldera herd, as they were now affectionately known, settled into the rhythms of the sanctuary. The frantic, fractured energy that had defined them upon their arrival was gone, replaced by the slow, deliberate grace of a true herd. They moved as one, grazed as a community, and rested in the protective circles that Silas had always described as the soul of the bison made visible. At their heart was Caldera, the volatile matriarch who had found a strange and silent peace. Her explosive temper had cooled into a firm, watchful authority. She was the undisputed leader, but her leadership was no longer born of fear, but of a fierce protective instinct that now had a proper outlet. Her bond with Leo remained a source of wonder for everyone at the sanctuary. It was not the affectionate, physical bond that Echo had shared with Silas. It was something wilder, more respectful, a partnership of sentinels. Leo would spend his afternoons in the pasture, working on his online high school courses from a durable tablet, and Caldera would often graze nearby, her presence a silent, massive acknowledgement of their shared victory over the storm. Leo himself had been transformed. The restless, cynical energy of the city had been scoured from him by the wind and the sun. He had learned the language of patience, the virtue of stillness. He still possessed a mind that moved at the speed of light, but he no longer saw the world as a problem to be solved with brute force logic. He had learned from Silas's journal that the most complex problems often required the simplest, most human solutions: presence, respect, and a willingness to listen to what is not being said. He developed a deep, abiding friendship with Hank, the two of them representing the bridge between the sanctuary's past and its future. Hank would share stories of Silas's uncanny intuition, and Leo would explain the science behind animal behavior, each man respecting the other's expertise. The elderly Dr. Aris Thorne watched the boy's transformation with a satisfaction that warmed his old heart. He saw in Leo not a replacement for Silas, but an evolution. Silas was the perfect man for his time, Aris told Hank one evening. He reminded us of a wisdom we had forgotten. But Leo is the man for this time. He can speak both languages. He can protect this legacy in a world Silas would no longer recognize. But the world, even in this remote sanctuary, has a way of introducing new and terrifying challenges. The peace of that golden autumn was shattered by a new kind of ghost. A creeping, invisible threat that no amount of patience could cure. It began with a single young bull from the Caldera herd, a spirited 2-year-old named Jasper. Hank was the first to notice. Jasper, normally boisterous and full of life, became withdrawn. He lost interest in his food, his coat lost its sheen, and he would stand for hours by the creek, his head hung low, a mirror image of the way Echo had looked in the Last Chance pen all those years ago. Hank, relying on the old ways, prepared herbal remedies, mixtures of willow bark and echinacea that had worked wonders on other ailments. But Jasper did not improve. Then, a week later, 2 more bison, both young females, began to show the same symptoms. A lethargy so profound it seemed to be draining the very life force from them. There was no fever, no coughing, no sign of injury. They were simply fading. A quiet panic began to ripple through the sanctuary staff. Dr. Thorne brought in a team of veterinarians from the state university. They ran every conceivable test: blood panels, parasite checks, bacterial cultures. Every result came back frustratingly normal. The ghost that haunted this herd was not one of trauma, but of biology, and it was a phantom that no one could identify. The herd's fragile social structure began to fray. The healthy animals seemed to instinctively shun the sick ones, a cruel but necessary survival instinct to protect the greater whole from a contagious threat. Caldera became a whirlwind of anxiety, her hard-won peace replaced by a renewed agitation. She would pace relentlessly, nudging the sick bison as if trying to wake them from a terrible dream. Her low rumbles of distress, a constant mournful presence in the valley. Leo felt a sense of helpless dread. He sat with the sick animals, just as he had sat with the entire herd months before. He offered them their favorite treats. He spoke to them in a low, soothing voice. But his presence, which had once calmed their fractured spirits, was powerless against this insidious physical decay. This was a problem that kindness alone could not solve. One evening, Leo stood with Hank by the fence, watching as a 4th bison began to stumble, its legs struggling to support its weight. Hank's face was a mask of grief and frustration. "I don't understand it," the old man whispered, his voice hoarse. Silas always knew what to do. He could look at an animal and see into its soul, see what was hurting it. "Silas was looking for a wound to the spirit, Hank," Leo said, his mind racing. "This isn't a wound, this is a poison. It's a line of bad code running through their system. We're looking in the wrong place." In that moment, something clicked into place for Leo. He had been so determined to honor Silas's legacy that he had abandoned the very tools that made him who he was. He had been trying to be Silas, but the sanctuary didn't need a new Silas. It needed Leo. He ran back to the cabin and found his great-uncle Aris poring over the latest inconclusive lab reports. "Uncle Aris," Leo said, his voice filled with a new, urgent energy. "I need my lab. I need my real lab." "What are you talking about, son?" Aris asked, looking up, startled by the boy's intensity. My laptop, my servers, all of it, Leo said. Silas used the best tools he had. His senses, his knowledge of plants, his heart. They were the most advanced tools of his world. I need to use the tools of my world. Not to replace his wisdom, but to build on it. Aris saw a fire in Leo's eyes he hadn't seen before. It wasn't the arrogant spark of his arrival. It was the focused flame of a problem solver who had finally found his true north. "What's your plan?" he asked. Leo's plan was a perfect synthesis of the two worlds he now inhabited. For the next 3 days, he became a shadow in the pasture. Using the trust he had so painstakingly built, he moved among the herd, causing no stress, no alarm. He collected samples, not with invasive needles, but with a quiet ingenuity. He gathered, shed hair from their favorite rubbing stones, took soil samples from the muddy banks of the creek where the sick animals seemed to congregate, and scraped saliva residue from a communal salt lick. He was a naturalist, observing and collecting with a reverence Silas would have admired. Then he returned to the cabin and became a digital warrior. He hooked his powerful laptop up to the sanctuary's satellite internet and transformed his small room into a command center. He fed the ambiguous data from the official lab reports into a custom-built diagnostic matrix. He wrote a script that would crawl through thousands of veterinary databases, searching for obscure case studies, looking for faint patterns, for correlations that would be invisible to the human eye. His search was guided not just by data, but by his own observations. He had noticed the sick bison's strange attraction to one particular bend in the creek. He had seen them chewing on a tough, deep-rooted weed that other animals avoided. He focused his data mining efforts on environmental toxins, specifically on bioaccumulators, plants known to draw up minerals from deep within the earth. For 48 hours, he barely slept. He drank endless cups of coffee, his fingers flying across the keyboard, his screen a cascade of data. Hank would quietly leave food by his door, shaking his head at the boy's intensity, but trusting that something important was happening. The breakthrough came at 3 in the morning. A single flashing alert on his screen. His program had found a match. It wasn't a perfect match, but a statistically significant correlation between his herd's symptoms and a handful of obscure poisoning cases in cattle in a remote region of South America. The culprit was a rare form of chronic selenium toxicity. Selenium was a vital nutrient in small doses, but a potent neurotoxin in high concentrations. It was being drawn from deep mineral deposits by a specific type of plant, an accumulator weed known as prince's plume. The very same weed Leo had seen the sick bison chewing on. The recent flash flood, he realized, must have eroded the creek bed, exposing a dormant, selenium-rich layer of soil and triggering a surge of growth in these toxic plants. It was the perfect crime, a natural poison, slow-acting, with symptoms. That mimicked a dozen other diseases, impossible to detect with standard tests. He ran out of the cabin and banged on the door of the bunkhouse where Hank and Aris were staying. He laid out his findings, his explanation a torrent of scientific terms and data points, but his conclusion was simple and clear. They had found the ghost. The solution was immediate. The contaminated section of the pasture was fenced off. The vets, now knowing what they were fighting, administered a chelating agent to help the bison's bodies purge the toxin. The recovery was slow, but it was steady. Within a month, Jasper and the other sick animals were regaining their strength, their energy, their light. The cloud of fear lifted from the herd, and the quiet, rhythmic peace returned to the valley. One crisp, clear evening, Leo stood with Hank and Aris on the porch of the rebuilt cabin, watching the caldera herd graze peacefully in the twilight. The setting sun glinted off the single horn of a powerful bull who stood at the edge of the group, a descendant of Echo himself, a living link to the sanctuary's founding. "Silas would be proud, Leo," Aris said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Not just because you saved them, but because of how you did it. Leo looked at the herd, at Caldera watching over them, her wildness now a symbol of resilience. He had come to this place to serve a punishment, but he had found a purpose. He understood now that the legacy of Silas and Echo wasn't about choosing the old ways over the new. It was about using whatever tools you had, whether they were forged in steel or in spirit, in the service of compassion. It was about seeing the world with a clear eye, but also with an open heart. The $1 bison had saved an old man from a fire. Decades later, the spirit of that bond, passed down through stories and a worn leather journal, had guided a boy from a different world to save the entire herd from a poison. The haven was safe. The legacy was not just being preserved. It was growing, evolving, becoming stronger and more resilient than ever before, ready for the challenges of a new century. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.